They brought a bulldozer to my front yard. Not for construction, but for destruction. The growl of the engine tore through the morning quiet, vibrating through my bones as I stepped out barefoot onto the dewy grass. My garden, my peace, my therapy, my late husband's final gift, stood trembling before the orange beast of metal that waited for one signal to destroy it. The air smelled of diesel and damp soil, a cruel mix of life and machine. I could see neighbors peeking through their curtains, watching like it was some kind of show. At the center of it all stood Cheryl Whitmore, our HOA president, her blazer spotless, her clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. Her lips were pressed into that permanent smirk she wore whenever she thought she was doing the right thing for the community. She didn't look at the flowers. She looked at me, like I was the problem that needed uprooting. The man beside the bulldozer revved the engine, waiting for her signal. I remember clutching my robe tighter, my voice shaking when I finally managed to speak. "Cheryl, what are you doing? This is my property." She glanced down at her clipboard, flipping through the pages as if she hadn't heard me. "Grace Miller, lot number 42, multiple violations of HOA landscaping standards. You were notified 3 times. Her tone was rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for this confrontation. I stepped between her and the garden, my bare feet sinking into the wet grass. "Violations? These are flowers, not buildings. I planted them myself. They're not hurting anyone." Cheryl sighed, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. "Unauthorized flower beds count as unapproved modifications. They alter the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood." The words hit like static, cold, meaningless bureaucratic noise. I glanced behind her, at the garden I had spent months cultivating. Rows of lilies, azaleas, and soft pink roses danced in the morning wind, brushing against the faded white picket fence Tom had painted before he died. Every petal was a piece of memory, a fragment of peace I had built after losing him. The smell of roses mixed with the burning stench of exhaust, and my stomach turned. "This isn't about flowers," I said quietly. "It's about control." She smiled, a slow venomous curl of her lips. "You can interpret it however you want, Grace. The fact remains, you didn't get approval. And when rules are ignored, order falls apart." Behind her the bulldozer growled again, spitting smoke into the blue morning sky. The sound was almost deafening now. I could hear my pulse in my ears, could feel the earth tremble under its weight. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her see that what she was doing wasn't enforcement. It was cruelty. But I knew that was what she wanted, to see me lose control. Instead, I took a slow breath. "You really think tearing up a widow's garden makes this place better?" For the first time, Cheryl's eyes flickered, not with guilt, but irritation. She turned slightly, speaking over her shoulder to the man in the hard hat. "We'll give her 1 week," she said. "If these aren't gone by then, we remove them and add the costs to her account." The man nodded, lowering the bulldozer's blade just enough to scrape the edge of the soil. The screech of metal against stone sent a shiver through my spine. I could almost hear Tom's voice, calm, patient, reminding me to breathe, to stay strong. I looked around at the neighbors, some watching with pity, others pretending not to see. Lisa Monroe stood on her porch across the street, her hands over her mouth. Our eyes met, and in that silent exchange, I knew she felt what I did. This wasn't just about flowers. It was about someone using power to humiliate. When Cheryl turned back to me, her expression was almost satisfied. 7 days, Grace, she said, her tone as sharp as the metal digging into my soil. After that, this will all be gone. Either you do it, or we will. I felt the sting of tears but forced them back. I wouldn't give her the pleasure. I just stared at her, at the neat press of her blazer, the perfection of her hair, the emptiness behind her eyes, and thought how small people could become when they were given a little bit of authority. The bulldozer's engine shut off, leaving behind a heavy silence. The birds had stopped singing. Cheryl walked back to her car, her heels clicking against the driveway like a countdown. I knelt beside my roses, running my fingers over the petals, whispering to them like I had to Tom's grave. "They're not taking you," I murmured. "Not yet." But deep down, I knew Cheryl wouldn't stop. And something inside me, something I hadn't felt since Tom died, began to stir. She had declared war on my peace, and I wasn't going to surrender it without a fight. The morning after the confrontation, I sat on the porch steps, staring at the garden as the sun broke through the trees. The bulldozer's tracks still scarred the driveway like open wounds. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Cheryl Whitmore's folded arms and that thin smile of satisfaction. But beneath the anger was something heavier. The aching reminder of why I'd bought this house in the first place. When Tom died, the world went quiet in a way that terrified me. We had spent 23 years together, moving from base to base during his time in the Air Force, never putting down roots for long. When he passed, I promised myself I'd find a place that felt permanent. Somewhere peaceful, where I could plant something and watch it grow. That's how I ended up in Maple Hollow Estates. The listing had said, a quiet, covenant-protected community with friendly neighbors and well-kept homes. At the time, those words sounded comforting. I thought protected meant safe. I thought friendly meant welcome. I didn't know covenant-protected really meant controlled. The first few months here were everything I needed. The street was lined with maples, and the air smelled of pine in the mornings. The house itself was small but perfect. White trim, wide porch, and a little patch of earth out front where the sunlight hit just right. I used to sit there for hours, hands buried in soil, feeling something like hope for the first time since Tom's funeral. I remember whispering to him, "It's not just land, Tom, it's healing." That's when I met Lisa Monroe, the neighbor across the street. She was one of those people who seemed to shine from the inside. Always barefoot, always carrying a mug of coffee. When she saw me planting my first row of roses, she waved and said, "If the HOA gives you grief about those, let me know. I've been here long enough to know how they operate." I laughed back then. I thought she was joking. Lisa was the kind of friend who'd show up uninvited but never unwelcome. She brought over cookies, shared gossip about the neighborhood, and taught me which days the trash crew actually showed up versus what the HOA schedule claimed. Through her, I started hearing the stories. The woman fined for painting her front door too beige. The man forced to remove a bird bath because it didn't match the approved stone type. And at the center of every story was Cheryl Whitmore. I'd seen Cheryl before, always front row at HOA meetings, clipboard never leaving her side. She carried herself like she owned the entire subdivision. Once, during a neighborhood barbecue, she'd come up to me, her tone sweet but eyes sharp. "You're the new homeowner on Lot 42, right? Welcome. I hope you read the community standards packet. It's quite detailed." I remember nodding politely, not realizing that the packet she referred to was over 100 pages long, buried with clauses about lawn heights, mailbox paint, and even acceptable species of trees. Later, Lisa told me Cheryl had been president for 6 years. Unchallenged. Nobody wanted to run against her. "She's a control freak," Lisa said, "but she hides it behind charm. Thinks she's saving the neighborhood from chaos." Still, back then, none of it touched me. My garden was small, my life quiet. I didn't attend HOA meetings or complain about anything. I stayed out of their way, and they stayed out of mine. Or so I thought. Then came the letter. It was a Thursday afternoon when I found it. A white envelope taped crookedly to my front door. The HOA logo stamped across the top in blue ink. I tore it open on the porch, expecting maybe a newsletter or an event notice. Instead, my stomach dropped. Notice of violation. Lot 42. Unauthorized landscaping modifications. You are hereby fined $200 for failure to comply with community standards. Remove all unapproved flower beds within 10 days to avoid further penalties. For a moment, I just stared at it, trying to make sense of the words. Unapproved flower beds? My garden wasn't some extravagant installation. It was just roses, lilies, and a few marigolds. All planted by hand, nothing mechanical, Nothing harmful. Lisa came over when she saw me standing there. She read the notice and shook her head. They can't do that, she said firmly. HOAs can regulate appearance, like lawn maintenance or paint color, but they can't dictate what kind of flowers you grow unless it's written in the bylaws. Her voice was reassuring, but my hands were trembling. I looked across the street, and there she was, Cheryl, watering her own plants, pretending not to notice me. Only her faint smile gave her away. That's when I realized something had shifted. The piece I thought I'd bought wasn't real. It was rented, borrowed from the approval of people like Cheryl Whitmore, and she had just decided to take it back. The HOA clubhouse smelled like disinfectant and cheap coffee. Rows of plastic folding chairs filled the narrow room, and the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights drowned out the low whispers of neighbors. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind where people showed up half out of duty and half out of curiosity. I had never been to one of these meetings before. But after receiving 2 more violation notices and another fine, I had no choice but to show up. Lisa sat beside me in the second row, her hand gently squeezing mine before the meeting began. Just stay calm, she whispered. They'll try to push you, but remember, you have every right to be here. Homeowners have the right to speak at board meetings. It's the law. Her voice steadied me, but only slightly. My heart was hammering hard enough to make my palms sweat. At the front of the room, Cheryl Whitmore stood behind a collapsible table like it was a podium. The HOA banner hung neatly behind her, perfectly centered, as if the universe itself revolved around her sense of order. Her lips curved upward when she noticed me sitting there, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. Let's begin, she said, tapping her gavel lightly against the table. First order of business, maintenance fees for common areas. Second, unapproved modifications by Lot 42. Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt heat crawl up my neck. Cheryl clicked her tongue softly. Mrs. Grace Miller, would you please stand? I rose, my knees unsteady. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and perfume. Cheryl adjusted her glasses, flipping through her folder with exaggerated precision. We've had multiple reports, she began, that Lot 42 has installed unapproved landscaping, specifically flower beds that extend beyond the permitted 2 feet from the foundation line. When our inspector issued a correction notice, the owner refused compliance. The word refused echoed in the air, heavy and deliberate. That's not true, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I never refused. I just asked for clarification about which rule I supposedly broke. A few people murmured. Cheryl raised her hand for silence. Mrs. Miller, the HOA standards are very clear. Landscaping that disrupts the uniform appearance of the community must be reviewed and approved. Your garden, while elaborate, was never submitted for review. It's a flower bed, Cheryl. Lisa interjected from beside me, her tone sharp. Half the neighborhood has the same thing. You can't target her for growing lilies. Cheryl's smile froze, thin and cold. Mrs. Monroe, she said, her voice syrupy with false politeness. You're welcome to speak during the homeowner comment period. For now, please allow the board to address the violation. The room went still. Lisa leaned back in her chair, muttering something under her breath that I didn't catch. My pulse thundered in my ears. I felt every pair of eyes on me. Neighbors I waved to on morning walks, people I barely knew but who suddenly saw me as the evening's entertainment. I swallowed hard. Cheryl, with respect, I've reviewed the bylaws. There's nothing in there about which types of flowers can or can't be planted. You can regulate height and maintenance, but not the species themselves. That got her attention. Her pen paused mid-note. I caught a flicker of annoyance before she smoothed it away with a practiced smile. Mrs. Miller, she said, our community has guidelines for a reason. Consistency is key. It's not personal. It's about preserving property values. I almost laughed at that. Property values, as if my little patch of roses could bring the market crashing down. A man in the back, Mr. Henson, if I remembered right, raised his hand. Her place looks fine to me, he said. Better than some of ours. Cheryl's gaze darted toward him, sharp as glass. We appreciate your opinion, Mr. Henson, but rules are rules. That phrase, rules are rules, seemed to hang over everything she said. It wasn't about fairness or community. It was about control. And for the first time since Tom died, I felt something rise inside me that wasn't sadness. It was anger, clean and steady. I took a breath. You can't fine me for something that isn't in writing. And if you try to remove my plants, I'll take it to the county. You're overstepping your authority. There was a collective murmur from the crowd. Cheryl's cheeks flushed just slightly before she leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table. Her eyes locked onto mine with quiet fury. Mrs. Miller, she said slowly, her voice dropping low enough that only I and those closest could hear. You may want to reconsider your attitude. The HOA has ways of handling non-compliance, and I would hate to see you become an example. The word example chilled me more than any fine ever could. She smiled, tapped her gavel again, and moved on to the next agenda item as though she hadn't just delivered a threat in plain sight. Lisa leaned toward me, whispering through clenched teeth. She's going too far. You can fight this, Grace. You have every right to. But as Cheryl's voice droned on about community trash schedules and lawn maintenance, I barely heard a word. All I could think about was that one phrase, "We'll make an example out of you." And deep down, I knew she meant it. By the time summer rolled in, my mailbox had become a weapon. Every week, without fail, there was another envelope stamped Maple Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. Inside, a new fine, $100 one week, $200 the next. By July, the total had crept past $1,000. They didn't even bother changing the wording anymore. It was the same cold line printed over and over again. Failure to comply with HOA landscaping standards. At first, I kept the letters stacked neatly in a kitchen drawer, thinking I could sort it out later, that maybe Cheryl would come to her senses. But the stack grew faster than my garden ever had. Eventually, I stopped opening them. The sound of paper tearing began to make my chest tighten. I told myself I wouldn't let it get to me, but each letter felt like another brick pressing down on my ribs. The neighbors started keeping their distance. The same people who used to wave as I watered my flowers now crossed the street instead. When I walked my dog, conversations stopped mid-sentence. No one wanted to be seen siding with the woman who defied the HOA. Fear had spread faster than gossip, and Cheryl was the one feeding it. Lisa Monroe was the only one who still came around. She'd bring over home-cooked meals, pretending it was just because she made too much. You shouldn't have to eat alone, she'd say softly, placing a casserole on my table. One night, she stayed late, her face lit only by the soft yellow glow of the kitchen lamp. You know what she's doing, right? She whispered. I nodded. She's trying to break me. Lisa hesitated, glancing at the stack of envelopes beside the toaster. It's more than that, Grace. I heard from Mike at the hardware store. Cheryl's husband owns Whitmore Landscaping. They're the HOA's only approved vendor for yard maintenance. Every time she forces someone to correct a violation, they pay her company. The room went still. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. You're saying she profits from this? Lisa nodded. Every dollar. It made perfect sense. Cheryl's obsession with aesthetic uniformity, her aggressive fines, her push to make everyone hire the same landscaping service. It wasn't about keeping Maple Hollow beautiful. It was about money and control. I spent the next morning combing through HOA paperwork, searching for proof. Buried in the bylaws was a clause about preferred service providers. The language was vague enough to look harmless, but the fine print revealed everything. Whitmore Landscaping held a maintenance agreement for the community. Cheryl wasn't just enforcing rules. She was profiting from every penalty. That night, as I sat at the dining table surrounded by scattered documents, I could almost hear Tom's calm voice in my head. Find the truth, Grace. The truth always roots deeper than lies. I began keeping records. Copies of every letter, every charge, every visit from the so-called inspector Cheryl sent by. My hands shook when I wrote, Not from fear this time, but from the steady burn of determination. Still, determination doesn't stop exhaustion. Weeks went by. The fines didn't stop. The mailman started leaving them without a word, slipping envelopes into my box like delivering poison. My garden had become quieter too. The flowers still bloomed, but I could sense the weight of what was coming, as if nature itself had gone still in anticipation. One humid afternoon, I found a new envelope that looked different. Thicker. My name typed in bold, the ink slightly smeared by the heat. I carried it inside and sat at the table before opening it. The words hit me like a physical blow. Final notice. Delinquent balance. $2,700. Failure to remit payment within 15 days will result in lien proceedings and possible foreclosure under HOA regulations. My throat closed. Foreclosure. They were threatening to take my home, my sanctuary, my last connection to Tom, over a few rows of flowers. The same soil where I'd knelt to rebuild my life had somehow become evidence against me. I stood in the doorway of my garden, the air thick with humidity and the faint scent of jasmine. The petals trembled in the evening breeze, unaware of the war being waged in their name. For a long moment, I wanted to give up, to pull them out just to make the fear stop. But then I imagined Cheryl's satisfied smile, her heels clicking as the bulldozer tore through my yard. No, I wouldn't give her that victory. Somewhere between the silence of my garden and the rustling of the trees, the fear hardened into resolve. If she wanted to turn this into a battle, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The night I decided to fight back, the house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. The stack of HOA letters sat on the table like a pile of threats I could no longer ignore. I brewed a cup of black coffee, pulled my laptop close, and began searching through the endless maze of county websites and property records. I wasn't sure what I was looking for yet, only that I couldn't let Cheryl win. The glow of the screen washed over my tired face as I typed HOA landscaping laws and homeowner plant rights. The deeper I went, the more I realized how murky everything was. HOAs thrived on confusion. Rules wrapped inside clauses, vague definitions hidden behind legal jargon. It was a fortress built on paperwork, but if Cheryl thought I'd give up, she didn't know how stubborn a grieving woman could be. Around midnight, I found something. A small note buried in the state environmental code, one I almost scrolled past. Native Flora Protection Act, Section 12B. Homeowners may not be prohibited from planting or maintaining native, drought-tolerant vegetation for conservation purposes. I sat up straighter, rereading it 3 times to be sure. There it was, the loophole. If I could prove my garden consisted of native or drought-tolerant plants, Cheryl couldn't legally order their removal, no matter what the HOA bylaws said. And if she kept pushing fines after that, it would be classified as selective enforcement, an abuse of authority under HOA law. I whispered the words aloud, testing how they felt on my tongue. Native flora protection. For the first time in months, something inside me stirred that wasn't fear. It was resolve. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office, a gray building that smelled faintly of paper and old air. The clerk behind the counter looked half asleep until I mentioned the HOA. "You're the 3rd person this month," she muttered, sliding a binder toward me. "Everything you need's in there." For the next hour, I flipped through bylaws and ordinances, marking every line that proved Cheryl was overstepping. I photocopied the native flora law, tucked it into my purse, and left the office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. But I still needed proof. Something tangible, undeniable. That's when I remembered Ray Sanders, a local landscaper Lisa had once mentioned. He was known for his work with conservation gardens and native plants. I found his number online and called him that afternoon. "Ray Sanders Landscaping," came a gravelly voice on the other end. "Hi," I said carefully. "My name's Grace Miller. I live in Maple Hollow Estates. I think I might need your help with something complicated." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Maple Hollow? Let me guess. Cheryl Whitmore giving you trouble?" I blinked in surprise. "You know her?" Everybody who's tried to plant a tree in that neighborhood knows her. What's the problem? I explained everything. The fines, the threats, the bulldozer, the claim that my flowers violated aesthetic uniformity. Ray listened without interrupting, the faint scratch of pen on paper audible through the phone. When I finished, he exhaled sharply. She's bluffing, he said. If you're planting natives, you're protected under state law. You know what you should do? His voice lowered, conspiratorial. Find plants that look exotic but are native, species they can't recognize or regulate. That's when he told me about the ghost orchid, a rare native species that thrived in certain types of soil and naturally altered its acidity. It didn't harm anything, but lawns planted too close to it tended to yellow. The beauty of it, Ray continued, is its nature doing what nature does. No chemicals, no interference, just biology. I could almost hear the smile in his voice. After we hung up, I sat in the garden as dusk fell, holding the printed copy of the law in my hands. The air smelled like rain and rebellion. The idea felt almost poetic, using nature itself as my defense. Cheryl had spent months trying to weaponize rules and bylaws against me. Now I had found my weapon, too. Only mine had roots and petals. I knelt by the roses, brushing my fingers over their soft edges, and whispered to the soil, if they hate my flowers, they'll love what's coming next. For the first time since Tom's death, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. That night, the sky hung low and heavy, the air still with the kind of quiet that comes just before rain. I waited until the neighborhood had gone dark, until the porch lights clicked off one by one and even the crickets seemed to hush. The moonlight spilled over my yard in a silver wash, soft enough to hide me, bright enough to guide my hands. Tonight wasn't about gardening. It was about reclaiming something they had tried to take. My peace, my freedom, my voice. The orchids lay in a small wooden crate beside me, their roots wrapped carefully in burlap. Ray Sanders had dropped them off earlier that evening, his truck engine cutting out just short of the cul-de-sac so as not to draw attention. They're fragile, he'd said, handing me the crate like it was made of glass. But once they take root, nothing moves them. They adapt to the soil, make it their own. He had smiled then, a knowing glint in his eye. They're survivors, like you. Now, kneeling in the cool grass, I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The soil was damp and rich, the scent of earth mixing with the faint perfume of night-blooming jasmine. Each time I pushed the trowel into the ground, I thought of Cheryl Whitmore's voice, that condescending tone, the sound of her heels tapping across my driveway like punctuation marks on my humiliation. With every scoop of dirt, I buried another piece of fear. When I set the first orchid into the ground, a strange calm spread through me. Its pale petals caught the moonlight, almost glowing against the dark soil. I pressed my palms into the earth, grounding myself, whispering softly, "You're home now." The cool dirt clung to my fingers like a promise. The night air carried a memory. Tom's voice, deep and steady, drifting through time. When you don't know what to say, let the garden speak for you. I closed my eyes. I could still see him kneeling beside me in our old backyard years ago, his hands guiding mine as we planted our first tree together. He used to believe that gardens were living prayers, that what you planted reflected what you hoped for. Tonight, my prayer wasn't for beauty. It was for strength. I moved slowly down the flower bed, planting one orchid after another, careful not to disturb the existing blooms. Their roots wound deep, their stems trembling in the faint breeze. It was quiet except for the rhythm of my breath and the soft rustle of leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and I froze, glancing toward Cheryl's house. Her windows were dark, curtains drawn tight. I exhaled and kept going. Each orchid I placed felt like an act of rebellion written in the language of soil and light. By the time I reached the end of the row, my knees were covered in dirt and my hands ached. I sat back on my heels, looking over the newly planted line. It wasn't much to anyone else, just a stretch of pale flowers under moonlight. But to me, it looked like defiance blooming. I stayed there for a long time, just listening. The sound of the wind through the trees, the faint hum of distant traffic, the rhythmic pulse of my own heart. Everything felt sharper, more alive. The orchids seemed to glow brighter with every passing minute, their petals opening ever so slightly as if greeting the night. When the first drops of rain began to fall, I didn't move. I let them soak into my hair, roll down my arms, and mingle with the dirt on my skin. The earth smelled stronger now, damp, raw, electric. I whispered to Tom, to the sky, to the flowers themselves. They can find me. They can threaten me. But they can't silence me. The rain picked up and thunder rolled softly in the distance. I gathered the empty pots and tools, tucking them back into the shed before anyone could notice. As I closed the door, lightning flickered across the sky, casting the garden in quick flashes of white. For a heartbeat, the orchids looked like flames. Inside the house, I toweled off and stood by the window, watching the rain soak the earth I'd just disturbed. It struck me then, I wasn't scared anymore. Not of Cheryl, not of the HOA, not of losing what I loved. Fear had been replaced by something steadier, something rooted. When dawn crept in, pale and quiet, I brewed coffee and stepped onto the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving everything glistening and new. The orchids stood tall, their petals open wide, as if the storm had only made them stronger. For the first time in months I smiled, not from relief but from pride. Then a sudden hiss broke the calm. Water erupted from the sprinkler heads lining my yard, every single one, all at once. Jets of cold water blasted against the flowers, pounding the soil, flooding the beds I had just tended. I froze, mug in hand, watching in disbelief as the orchids swayed under the attack. Across the street, Cheryl Whitmore stood in her robe, a coffee cup in hand, pretending to adjust her mailbox while sneaking glances my way. Her sprinkler system had accidentally triggered again. She wanted to drown my rebellion before it could bloom. But as the water finally sputtered to a stop, I saw something she didn't. The orchids straightening back up, their petals glistening, untouched by her storm. I smiled faintly and whispered to the morning air, "You'll have to do better than that, Cheryl." For 3 days after the sprinkler incident, Maple Hollow sat in an eerie calm. The orchids had survived, and despite Cheryl's best efforts, the HOA seemed to lose interest in me, at least temporarily. I spent those mornings sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the new blooms unfold under the sun. They had taken to the soil faster than I'd expected, their roots sinking deep, their petals turning from a faint ivory to a subtle shade of violet. It was as if they belonged here all along. But by the 4th morning, something strange began to happen. I noticed it first across the street, on Cheryl's immaculate front lawn. Her grass, usually the color of emeralds, had begun to fade at the edges, turning a sickly yellow. At first, I assumed it was the weather, maybe overwatering, maybe heat stress. But by the next afternoon, the yellow patches had spread, creeping like spilled paint across her yard. And not just hers. 2 other lawns near mine were starting to show the same discoloration, thin streaks cutting through the green like veins of gold. I told myself it was a coincidence. I even knelt by my orchids, brushing the soil between my fingers to see if something had changed. It felt normal, damp, rich, alive. I whispered to them, half smiling, "You're not causing this, are you?" By the weekend, the whispers began. From my kitchen window, I could see the neighbors huddled on sidewalks, hands on hips, pointing at the spreading yellow across the cul-de-sac. Their words floated faintly through the humid air. Fungus? Contamination? Fertilizer gone bad? By Sunday, Cheryl had had enough of speculation. She marched across the street with her usual authority, clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her lawn was a patchwork of green and gold now, the color leaching out from the side nearest my property. Her lips were drawn tight, and even from a distance, I could see the anger simmering behind her smile. "Grace," she called, her tone crisp, "we need to talk." I stepped outside slowly, drying my hands on a towel. "Good morning, Cheryl. Beautiful day, isn't it?" She ignored the pleasantry. Don't play games. Whatever you're doing to this neighborhood, it stops now. I blinked, feigning confusion. Doing? You mean my flowers? Her jaw clenched. I mean whatever's killing the grass. Everyone can see it started from your side of the street. You think it's funny, don't you? Some sort of petty revenge? Behind her, two neighbors lingered near their driveways, pretending not to listen but hanging on every word. I crossed my arms. My garden isn't killing anything. Maybe your landscapers used the wrong treatment. Chemical burns happen when you over-fertilize. Cheryl's nostrils flared. We don't make mistakes like that. This is deliberate sabotage. The accusation hung between us. I could almost hear the blood rushing in my ears. Sabotage? I repeated softly. You really think I have the time, or the interest, to destroy your lawn? You've fined me nearly $3,000, Cheryl. I'd say that's more than enough damage for one person. Her eyes narrowed. We'll see what the county says about that. Then she turned sharply, heels snapping against the concrete as she marched back across the street. The crowd of onlookers scattered, pretending to busy themselves. I watched her retreat, my pulse still pounding. That afternoon, I called Ray. He arrived an hour later in his old pickup, a shovel rattling in the back. You said it's yellowing? He asked, stepping out. Half the neighborhood, I said, starting from Cheryl's place. Ray knelt near my orchids, pressing his hand into the soil. He scooped some into a small container, sniffed it, then smiled faintly. It's the orchids, he said simply. My stomach tightened. They're doing this? He nodded, unbothered. In a way, the roots release trace minerals that alter the soil's pH slightly. Perfectly natural. It's why they thrive where others struggle. The grass? It's not dying. It's just not getting what it's used to. It'll recover eventually. So I haven't heard anything. Not unless you call nature doing its job hurting. He brushed his palms off on his jeans and looked toward Cheryl's yard, where the yellow had deepened into a pale brown halo. If she thinks you're dumping chemicals, she's wrong. There's nothing illegal about this. It's just balance. I almost laughed, a sound more of disbelief than amusement. Balance. The word rolled around in my mind, strange and satisfying. After months of being crushed under rules and fines, it felt poetic that the very earth was pushing back in my defense. That night, I sat on my porch again, listening to the crickets sing over the faint hum of distant air conditioners. The moonlight glinted off the orchid's petals, and the rest of the neighborhood lay in quiet frustration. Every lawn except mine had started to show signs of fading. People whispered about it in the next day's HOA email thread, the subject line reading, "Urgent, grass disease spreading through Maple Hollow." I didn't reply, though I couldn't help but smirk when I read Cheryl's post. This sudden outbreak coincides suspiciously with recent unauthorized plantings. The board will be investigating. By Tuesday, the whispers turned into open conversation. When I walked my dog, people avoided eye contact. But a few, especially the ones who'd been quietly cheering me on, nodded with faint smiles. One man even muttered as I passed, "Maybe nature's picking sides." Lisa came by that evening with a basket of tomatoes from her backyard. "You're not doing this, are you?" she asked quietly, but there was a glint of amusement in her eyes. I shook my head. "Just planting flowers, Lisa," she grinned. "Well, keep planting. I've never seen Cheryl so rattled." Still, I could sense the storm building. Cheryl wasn't the type to let something like this go unanswered. She had to be in control, and control was slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers. 2 days later, I got confirmation. It was just after noon when a white SUV pulled into Cheryl's driveway. The logo on the door read, "Environmental Compliance Solutions." A tall man in khakis and a polo shirt stepped out, carrying a briefcase and a small metal case that looked scientific enough to be intimidating. Cheryl greeted him eagerly, gesturing wildly toward her lawn, pointing, of course, toward my house. From my porch, I watched as he crouched near the border between our properties, scooping soil into a plastic bag. I could see Cheryl standing over him, arms crossed, her mouth moving rapidly. The inspector nodded, jotting notes on a clipboard. Lisa appeared beside me, her voice low. She really called an investigator? Looks like it. What happens if they find something? They won't, I said quietly. There's nothing to find. The man worked his way down the street, collecting samples from 3 other yards before finally packing up and shaking Cheryl's hand. As he climbed back into his SUV, Cheryl turned her head just enough for our eyes to meet. Her expression was all venomous triumph, like she believed she'd already won. But deep down, I wasn't worried. Ray's words echoed in my mind. Nothing illegal, just balance. That night, as the streetlights flickered on, I walked barefoot through my yard, letting my fingers brush over the orchid petals. The air felt thick with tension, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Somewhere in the dark, a sprinkler sputtered to life, hissing for only a few seconds before dying again. Even the water seemed wary now. I crouched by the flowers, their soft glow reflecting in my eyes, and whispered, "Let her dig all she wants. The truth is buried deeper than she'll ever reach." Because I knew, by morning Cheryl would learn that nature can't be fined, and justice sometimes blooms quietly, one root at a time. The following Tuesday morning, a county vehicle rolled slowly down Maple Hollow Lane. The logo on the side read Environmental Compliance Division, and for a moment it was so surreal that I almost laughed. Cheryl had done it. She had escalated a patch of yellowing grass into an official county investigation. The truck parked in front of my house, and a tall man stepped out, clipboard in hand. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a calm, professional expression and boots that had clearly seen their share of dirt. He introduced himself as Officer Daniels. "Morning, ma'am," he said, extending a firm handshake. "We've had a report of possible chemical contamination originating from this property." Across the street, Cheryl Whitmore hovered like a crow, pretending to adjust her mail while keeping her eyes locked on us. Her presence radiated smug anticipation. She was dressed too neatly for a Tuesday morning, pressed slacks, hair curled, and that familiar air of self-importance that seemed to follow her everywhere. I folded my arms. "Chemical contamination?" I repeated, forcing a polite tone. "Officer, you're welcome to look around. I've got nothing to hide." He nodded, pulling on gloves and kneeling beside one of my orchids. His movements were deliberate, scientific. He brushed his fingers along the soil, lifted a bit into a sample vial, and sniffed it briefly before sealing it. Then he crouched lower, studying the base of the flowers. The orchids gleamed under the late morning sun, their petals soft but defiant. Cheryl couldn't resist stepping closer. "You see that?" she said sharply. "The soil's darker near her property line, and her flowers, they're not native. She's planting invasive species to destroy our community's grass." Officer Daniels looked up slowly. "Ma'am," he said, "please give me space to complete the inspection." Cheryl flushed but didn't back away entirely. "You'll find chemicals, I guarantee it," she muttered. She's been bragging about her little project all over the neighborhood. I met Daniel's eyes, steady and calm. "I haven't bragged about anything," I said quietly. "I've been too busy paying HOA fines to brag." That earned a faint, almost imperceptible smile from him. He stood brushing the dirt from his gloves. "You mind if I check the irrigation system?" "Go ahead," I said, stepping aside. He crouched by the sprinkler head, examined the pipes, then moved on to the flower bed closest to Cheryl's property. He took 2 more soil samples, carefully labeling each one. When he straightened up, he pulled out a small handheld reader, inserted one of the vials, and waited for the results to flash across the screen. Cheryl leaned forward eagerly, her face pale with excitement. After a moment, the officer looked at her and said evenly, "No trace of chemical agents detected. pH variations within natural range. Whatever's causing your lawn discoloration isn't coming from artificial contaminants." Cheryl blinked as if the words didn't register. "That can't be right. Check again. You must have missed something." He turned off the reader, his patience unwavering. "Ma'am, I've tested in 3 locations. It's organic soil variation, possibly influenced by plant root chemistry. Perfectly natural. Nothing illegal here." I watched Cheryl's face collapse from superiority into disbelief. Her mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish gasping for air. "So," I asked lightly, "am I free to keep my flowers, officer?" He turned to me, the corner of his mouth twitching in the faintest trace of admiration. "You've done nothing wrong, Mrs. Miller. Beautiful orchids, by the way. Not many folks around here, plant natives." The sound of Cheryl's sharp inhale cut through the air like a knife. She stormed back toward her driveway without another word, her heels stabbing the pavement. Officer Daniels removed his gloves, jotting something down on his clipboard. "I'll file my report by the end of the day," he said. Then he paused, glancing back at me. "But between us, they're not going to let this go. I overheard your HOA president mention escalating to the county board. You might want to be ready." The satisfaction I felt was tempered by a ripple of unease. "County court?" I asked quietly. He nodded once, serious now. "They're taking this beyond neighborhood politics. Seems she's determined to win, even if she has to drag you into a legal fight to do it." He tipped his hat, climbed into his truck, and drove off down the street. I stood there watching him go, my hands buried in the dirt at my sides, feeling the hum of the earth beneath me. Across the road, Cheryl's door slammed shut. For the first time, she looked cornered, and I realized that victory wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, like roots spreading underground. Still, Officer Daniels' words echoed in my head. They're taking this to county court. And deep down, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The county courthouse was colder than I expected. Not just in temperature, but in atmosphere. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you acutely aware of every sound, every breath. Rows of wooden benches lined the chamber, their polish dulled by years of disputes and broken civility. I sat at the front table, hands folded tightly in my lap, while Cheryl Whitmore and two members of the HOA board occupied the table opposite me. At the center sat Judge Harper, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice that could silence a room with a single word. "This hearing," she began, "is to determine whether the Maple Hollow Estates Homeowners Association has the legal authority to impose fines or remove landscaping from the property of Grace Miller." Cheryl straightened in her seat, her confidence practically oozing across the floor. "Your Honor," she began, her tone dripping with practiced charm, "this isn't about flowers. It's about community standards. Mrs. Miller's actions have caused property damage, soil contamination, and public unrest within our neighborhood." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were glossy photos of her yellowed lawn, printed on heavy paper. "As you can see," she said, gesturing dramatically, "her plantings caused irreversible harm to multiple properties." I almost smiled. The pictures were impressive. Angles chosen to exaggerate every shadow, filters darkened for effect. It looked less like a lawn and more like a wasteland. But I stayed quiet. Judge Harper peered over her glasses. "Do you have laboratory evidence of chemical contamination?" Cheryl hesitated, then gestured toward another page. "Our landscaper's statement confirms—" "That's not a certified report," the judge interrupted. "It's an opinion." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Cheryl's face twitched. When it was my turn, I rose slowly, carrying the folder Officer Daniels had sent me. Official soil reports with clear documentation. No chemical presence detected. Soil acidity within natural range. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "these are the county's own findings. What happened to the lawns isn't vandalism or sabotage. It's natural soil variation caused by native flora." I handed over a second packet. Printouts from the Native Flora Protection Act. According to state law, homeowners cannot be penalized for planting native, drought-tolerant vegetation. I've done nothing outside that right. Lisa Monroe stood next. Her voice was calm but firm. "Judge, I've lived across from Grace for 3 years. I've seen how the HOA targets certain homeowners while ignoring others. Cheryl's rules aren't about order. They're about control." A few people in the back nodded. Even some HOA members exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Harper leaned back, tapping her pen. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, These allegations against you are serious. Before I issue a ruling, I'm ordering a full financial audit of your association." The color drained from Cheryl's face. "An audit? But—" The gavel struck once, silencing her. "We'll reconvene when the audit is complete," the judge said firmly. "Until then, no further fines or enforcement actions are to be taken against Mrs. Miller." I exhaled slowly, the weight in my chest easing for the first time in months. Cheryl didn't look at me as she gathered her papers, but the tremor in her hand told me everything I needed to know. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time I could feel the ground shifting in my favor. It took 3 weeks for the results of the county audit to come back, though the rumors started long before the official report did. Maple Hollow had gone from silent suburbia to a whispering hive of speculation. People met on sidewalks and in driveways, exchanging theories about missing funds and kickbacks. By the time the county posted the notice on the community bulletin board, everyone already knew. Cheryl Whitmore's empire was crumbling. The report was brutal. It detailed every transaction, every inflated invoice, every payment made from HOA accounts to Whitmore Landscaping, the company Cheryl's husband supposedly managed independently. Thousands of dollars meant for community maintenance had been rerouted into their personal bank account. The audit also revealed undisclosed consulting fees and duplicate charges for lawn services that never happened. It was corruption disguised as order, and now it was exposed for the entire neighborhood to see. The county ordered an immediate leadership restructuring. Cheryl was suspended from her position, pending further investigation, and a special meeting was called to elect a temporary board. The same neighbors who had once feared her now arrived in droves, eager to watch her fall. I didn't plan to attend, but Lisa convinced me. "You started this," she said. "You deserve to see it end." When we walked into the clubhouse, the air was thick with tension. Cheryl sat at the front, pale but composed, trying to maintain the dignity that power had once given her. Her clipboard lay untouched on the table, her weapon rendered useless. The county officer stood before the crowd, reading the findings aloud. Each sentence landed like a hammer blow. Unauthorized transfers, personal gain, falsified reports. By the time he finished, the room had turned on her. A man from the back, Mr. Henson, stood up, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "You fined us for cracked sidewalks while stealing from the community? You humiliated good people, Cheryl." Others joined in. The same neighbors who'd once whispered behind curtains now spoke openly, some shouting, some demanding refunds, some just shaking their heads in disbelief. Cheryl tried to respond, her voice cracking under the weight of their anger. "Everything I did was for this community," but no one believed her anymore. When she finally gathered her papers and walked toward the exit, she avoided my eyes. Her shoulders, once squared with authority, had folded inward. I didn't feel joy watching her go, only a quiet, tired kind of peace. Justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaling after holding your breath too long. Lisa touched my arm. "It's over," she whispered. I looked out the window toward Cheryl's house across the street, where the grass still bore faint traces of yellow near the Orchids border. I smiled softly. "Maybe. But Cheryl's lawn," I said, "has one more lesson left to give." By the time autumn rolled in, Maple Hollow had gone strangely quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence. This one hummed with relief, with gossip finally running out of fuel. Cheryl Whitmore had officially resigned, her name stripped from every HOA document and sign. The new board promised transparency, monthly reports, and no more selective enforcement. For the first time since moving here, I could breathe without bracing for the next fine. But nature, it seemed, wasn't finished telling the story. 2 weeks after Cheryl's resignation, landscapers arrived at her house to lay down a brand new lawn. Fresh sod, chemical treatments, the whole show of starting over. They worked from dawn till dusk for 3 days, leaving behind a yard that looked straight out of a magazine. Perfect stripes of emerald green, sharp edges, no weeds in sight. Cheryl wasn't around to see it. She'd packed up and left town quietly, though her husband stayed behind to supervise repairs. For a while, it looked beautiful, too beautiful. Then, slowly, the edges began to change. Pale streaks appeared along the property line, faint at first, like a watercolor wash bleeding through paper. Within days, the yellow deepened, creeping inward in irregular shapes. The landscapers came back twice, spraying, reseeding, swearing it would hold. But it didn't. By the end of the month, half the lawn had surrendered to the same soft decay that had first started it all. Lisa came by one morning, coffee in hand, a grin tugging at her lips. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to keep from smiling. "I have. They're calling it Maple Hollow Karma," she said, laughing under her breath. "Guess the soil remembers who tried to control it." I didn't say anything. I just knelt beside my orchids, running my fingers over the petals. They were thriving, taller, stronger, more vibrant than ever. The air smelled faintly of them, sweet and sharp, a reminder that nature balances itself without permission. As the breeze stirred through the yard, I felt something like peace settle over me. Not triumph, just quiet understanding. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the maples, my phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen from an unfamiliar number. "This is Megan Lewis from Channel 5 News. Mrs. Miller, your story's making headlines." The morning after the news story aired, I woke to the sound of wind moving gently through the orchids. Their petals brushed together like whispers, soft and rhythmic, blending with the rustle of maple leaves overhead. The garden had grown dense and lush, spilling color across the yard in a way that felt almost defiant. I stood on the porch barefoot, coffee in hand, breathing in the scent of earth and rain. For the first time since I moved to Maple Hollow, I felt like the land and I were finally speaking the same language. The HOA had changed since the audit. Cheryl's name was gone, her bylaws rewritten. The new board sent out a letter last week promising transparency, fairness, and respect for homeowners. It was ironic. The same rules once used to punish me were now rewritten to protect people like me. I had been their warning, their example, and their turning point all at once. Lisa came by mid-morning, her usual coffee mug in hand and an easy grin on her face. "You're famous now," she teased, stepping through the gate. "Saw you on the news last night. The gardener who beat the HOA. Half the county's talking about you." I laughed, though quietly. I didn't set out to be a story. I just wanted peace. She smiled, setting her mug down on the porch rail. Sometimes peace needs to be earned before it can grow. We sat together for a while, watching the light shift across the petals. The air was warm, humming with bees and the distant sound of children playing down the street. Life had moved on, softer now but stronger too. I thought about everything that had happened, the bulldozer, the fines, the meetings, the humiliation, and how it had all led to this. Cheryl had tried to bury me under bureaucracy and fear, but she forgot one simple truth. I was a gardener. Everything I planted, I nurtured. Even resistance. Especially resistance. The legal fight had taught me more than I ever expected to learn. I discovered that HOAs, for all their power, are still bound by state and county law. They can regulate appearance, yes, but they cannot dictate life. Homeowners have the right to plant native flora, to conserve water, to live without selective enforcement disguised as standards. What Cheryl called rebellion was simply me exercising that right. As the sun climbed higher, the orchids shimmered with color. Whites, purples, and soft blues swaying in the breeze. Each flower felt like a victory, not just over her, but over silence itself. Lisa rose to leave, brushing soil from her jeans. "So," she said, smiling, "what's next for Maple Hollow's most infamous gardener?" I glanced toward the edge of my property, where a new family had just moved in. A couple painting their fence the same color Cheryl once banned. "I don't know," I said, "but whatever it is, I'll be ready." The wind swept through the garden again, bending the orchids gently, their roots deep and unshakable. "They tried to bury me," I whispered. But they forgot. I was a gardener. What would you have done if your HOA tried to destroy your peace? Would you fight back or surrender? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you've ever faced power-hungry officials or corrupt HOAs, share your story. Your voice might help someone else find theirs. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another real story of justice and courage. And remember, sometimes the smallest seed of resistance grows into the strongest tree of freedom.